37 Martin Luther King Jr. quotes, best lessons about love and peace. Martin Luther King Jr. is best known for his contributions to the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. He was the leader of the American Civil Rights Movement that organized several peaceful protests as the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1963, including the March on Washington. Martin Luther King Jr. influenced people around the world with his work, and he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Martin Luther King Jr. motivational quotes. Read the best lessons from Martin Luther King Jr. quotes that will influence us a lot in our life so that we can fight for our rights. Peace quotes by MLK Jr. 1. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Martin Luther King Jr. 2. Those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. Martin Luther King Jr. 3. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. Martin Luther King Jr. 4. Peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal. Martin Luther King Jr. Darkness quotes by MLK Jr. 5. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Martin Luther King Jr. 6. Every man must decide whether he will walk in the light of creative altruism or in the darkness of destructive selfishness. Martin Luther King Jr. 7. The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. Martin Luther King Jr. Education quotes by MLK Jr. 8. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. Martin Luther King Jr. 9. The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. Martin Luther King Jr. Love quotes by MLK Jr. 10. There can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. Martin Luther King Jr. 11. Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy to a friend. Martin Luther King Jr. 12. Power without love. Without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. Martin Luther King Jr. 13. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. Martin Luther King Jr. 14. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Martin Luther King Jr. 15. Man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. Martin Luther King Jr. 16. At the center of nonviolence stands the principle of love. Martin Luther King Jr. 17. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. Martin Luther King Jr. 18. Without love, there is no reason to know anyone, for love will, in the end, connect us to our neighbors, our children, and our hearts. Martin Luther King Jr. Life quotes by MLK Jr. 19. A man who won't die for something is not fit to live. Martin Luther King Jr. 20. No person has the right to rain on your dreams. Martin Luther King Jr. 21. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? Martin Luther King Jr. 22. Lightning makes no sound until it strikes. Martin Luther King Jr. 23. Not everybody can be famous, but everybody can be great because greatness is determined by service. Martin Luther King Jr. 24. It does not matter how long you live, but how will you do it? Martin Luther King Jr. 25. If I cannot do great things, I can do small things in a great way. Martin Luther King Jr. 26. Not everybody can be famous, but everybody can be great because greatness is determined by service. Martin Luther King Jr. 27. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Martin Luther King Jr. MLK Jr. quotes to fight for civil rights. 28. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Martin Luther King Jr. 29. There is no gain without struggle. Martin Luther King Jr. 30. A right delayed is a right denied. Martin Luther King Jr. 31. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. Martin Luther King Jr. 32. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Martin Luther King Jr. 33. One has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Martin Luther King Jr. 34. The choice is not between violence and nonviolence, but between nonviolence and non-existence. Martin Luther King Jr. 35. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. Martin Luther King Jr. 36. Our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power. We have guided missiles and misguided men. Martin Luther King Jr. 37. Take the first step in faith. You don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step. Martin Luther King Jr. I hope you liked the above Martin Luther King Jr. quotes. Don't forget to mention the best line that you liked most from the above lines in the comment box below.